Abandoned by her children, an old woman lived in cold and filth until she found this under her bed. Margaret had always been the heart of her home. She remembered a time when the laughter of her children echoed throughout the house, when the walls were filled with life and love. She used to wake up to the smell of breakfast, with her kids running around, getting ready for school. It had been so full of joy back then. But now it was all just memories. The house, once warm and inviting, had turned cold and lifeless, just like the space inside Margaret's heart. It had been years since her children had left her, years since they had forgotten to check in, forgotten to call or visit. One by one, they moved on with their lives, getting married, having children, and creating families of their own. They had their own busy worlds, and Margaret, once so needed, had become an afterthought. She remembered the last time she had seen her son, David. He had promised to visit, but as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, she had realized he wasn't coming. It was the same story with her daughter, Emma. She had tried to stay in touch for a while, but slowly their calls became less frequent, and eventually they stopped altogether. Margaret tried to stay strong, telling herself that she was fine. She told herself that her children had their own lives, that they were busy. But deep down, Margaret couldn't help but feel the sting of being forgotten. She had devoted her entire life to raising them, and now she was alone. Her health had begun to decline as well. Each day, her body seemed to grow weaker, and it became harder to do the simple things she once took for granted. Cooking, cleaning, even walking across the room, it all felt like too much. Her hands trembled as she reached for things, and her breath became shallow as she moved around the house. The once clean floors were now covered in dust, and the kitchen was filled with dishes she had no energy to wash. The small house that had once been a warm, bustling home now felt like a prison. The cold, damp air seemed to seep into every corner of her house. It wasn't just the temperature that was cold, it was the silence. Margaret would sit by the window, staring out at the world going on around her, wishing she could be part of it again. The neighborhood kids played in the streets, and families gathered for dinner, but Margaret was no longer a part of any of it. Her once bustling home now sat in solitude, the air heavy with the weight of her loneliness. At night, the house felt even colder. Margaret would try to sleep, but the quiet would keep her awake. She would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, wishing for a visitor, wishing for someone to come and tell her that she was loved, that she wasn't forgotten. But no one came. She would eventually fall asleep, only to wake up to the same emptiness. There were moments when Margaret would pick up the phone to call one of her children. She thought about it every day. But every time she dialed their number, she hesitated. What would she say? Would they even answer? She didn't want to burden them with her loneliness. She didn't want them to feel guilty for not visiting, so she put the phone back down and sank deeper into her solitude. Margaret had grown used to it. She had grown used to the silence and the cold. She had grown used to the idea that her children were no longer a part of her life. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, when the world outside her window was still, she would remember. She would remember the times when her children would laugh around the dinner table, when they would tell her about their days, and when they would ask for her advice. She missed those days more than she could ever say. But now, the house was just a house. The memories were still there, but they were becoming harder to hold on to. The walls, which once held so many happy moments, were now covered in dust, and the photographs of her children on the mantelpiece were faded with time. The house, once filled with love, now felt empty, just like her heart. She would often wonder what had gone wrong. Had she done something to push them away? Had she been too demanding? Or had they just outgrown her? There were so many unanswered questions, but no one to ask. No one to help her make sense of the loneliness that seemed to consume her. Despite it all, Margaret kept up with the little things. She would still try to tidy up the house, though it seemed like a losing battle. She would still make her meals, though they were simpler now. She would sit by the window, watching the world, hoping that one day someone would come and fill the silence. But as the days passed, the hope seemed to fade a little more. Sometimes Margaret would look at the clock and wonder if her children even thought about her anymore. Did they remember her birthday? Did they ever wonder how she was doing? She had no way of knowing. The days stretched on, one after the other, until they all felt the same. She tried to keep busy with small tasks, but there was only so much to do in a house that no longer felt like home. The winter was especially hard. The cold seemed to get into her bones, and the house felt colder than ever. Margaret would try to wrap herself in blankets, but the chill in the air always found its way in. She would often sit by the fireplace, staring into the flames, but even the warmth couldn't chase away the emptiness inside her. Still, Margaret held on. She held on to the hope that one day her children would come back, that they would remember her and realize how much she needed them. But as the years went by, that hope began to fade. It became harder and harder to believe that things would ever change. In the quiet of her lonely house, Margaret's thoughts turned inward. She wondered if she had made a mistake somewhere along the way. Had she been too hard on them when they were young? Had she not given them enough space as they grew older? There were so many what-ifs, but no answers. As the months passed, Margaret became more and more isolated. Her only connection to the outside world was the occasional trip to the grocery store, where she would nod at the familiar faces but never speak. She had grown used to being invisible, to blending into the background. And though she still held on to the memories of her children, she began to wonder if they had forgotten her completely. But even in the deepest of loneliness, Margaret found small moments of peace. She still had the memories, still had the love she had given to her children. Those were things no one could take away from her. And though the house was cold and her body was frail, there was a flicker of light inside her. She wasn't ready to give up. She wasn't ready to let go of the hope that one day someone would remember her. Margaret's days had become predictable, like a long, quiet march through time. The mornings were always the same. The chill of the air would creep through the cracks in the walls, and Margaret would awake in her small bed, alone. Her body, once strong and active, now felt stiff and tired each time she moved. It took her a little longer each day to get out of bed, her bones creaking as she stretched and sat up. The house was silent, except for the occasional sound of her own breathing or the faint rustle of leaves outside the window. There were no voices to greet her, no one to ask how she was doing. She would shuffle across the floor to the small kitchen, her slippers scuffing against the worn wood, and begin preparing breakfast. Her hands shook slightly as she worked, but she still managed to make herself a simple meal. She wasn't hungry for much, but eating something helped fill the emptiness inside her, even if just for a moment. After breakfast, Margaret would go about her day, doing what she could to make the house feel somewhat livable. The floors needed sweeping, the windows were full of dust, and the furniture was in need of a good cleaning. But the work was never-ending, and no matter how much she tried, the house seemed to remain the same. It was as if the weight of her loneliness had settled into the very walls of the house, making everything harder. She tried to keep her spirits up by telling herself that at least she was alive, at least she still had the ability to take care of herself. But each task seemed to drain her energy a little more. Margaret could feel her strength fading. Sometimes she would sit down in the middle of the floor, too tired to move, and stare at the mess around her. The house wasn't filthy, but it was far from the neat, tidy place it once was. She had tried to clean it, but it felt like an impossible task. The loneliness weighed on her the most in the evenings. After the sun set, the house grew darker, and the silence became more oppressive. Margaret would sit in her favorite chair by the window, watching the world outside. The streets were filled with people, families walking together, children playing, neighbors chatting. It was like a world she no longer belonged to. She had once been a part of that world, full of laughter and love, but now she was invisible, forgotten. Sometimes she would see a mother and her child walking by, laughing and talking. She would watch them, a deep ache forming in her chest. She remembered when her own children had been small. She had taken them to the park, helped them with their homework, and listened to their stories. But those days felt so far away now. Her children had grown up, moved away, and had their own families. They no longer had time for her. The thought of it made Margaret's heart heavy, but she tried not to dwell on it too long. Her life had become a routine of silence and solitude. There was no one to share her day with, no one to laugh with, no one to talk to. The only sound she heard was the ticking of the clock on the wall, the occasional creak of the floorboards as she moved, and the soft whisper of the wind outside. Sometimes the wind would howl through the trees, but it only served to remind Margaret of how isolated she truly was. There were moments when she would feel a deep longing for her children, a yearning for their presence. She remembered when they were little, how they would rush into her arms when they came home from school, telling her about their day. But now, the house was empty, and there was no one to share those moments with. The longing for their company was almost too much to bear. But Margaret tried to stay strong. She didn't want to burden them with her sadness, didn't want them to feel guilty for not being there. So she kept it to herself, pretending everything was fine. The evenings were the hardest for Margaret. As the darkness settled over the house, she would try to keep herself busy, but there was little to do. She didn't watch television. There was no one to share it with, and the silence made it hard to focus. Sometimes she would try to read a book, but her eyes were tired, and the words would blur on the page. The loneliness crept in again, and she would put the book down, staring into the empty space in front of her. The cold was another challenge. The house, with its thin walls and old windows, wasn't warm enough to fight off the chill of the winter months. Margaret would try to wrap herself in blankets, but they never seemed to be enough. The cold seeped into her bones, and it made her feel even more alone. She would sit by the fireplace, the warmth of the fire offering only temporary relief from the freezing air. The flickering flames were comforting, but they couldn't chase away the loneliness that lingered. Her health continued to decline, and Margaret could feel it in every part of her body. Her legs ached after walking for just a few minutes, and her hands trembled as she held on to things. It was getting harder to do even the simplest of tasks. She had always been a proud woman, independent and strong, but now she felt weak and helpless. The thought of asking for help never crossed her mind. It seemed too difficult to admit that she needed it. She didn't want to be a burden to anyone, especially her children. Sometimes, when the loneliness became unbearable, Margaret would pick up the phone and dial one of her children's numbers. But she would stop before the call connected. She didn't want to interrupt their busy lives. She didn't want to be a reminder of the past, a reminder of a time when she was needed. So she would hang up the phone and set it down, the silence in the house growing even louder. Margaret still had memories, though. Memories of better days when her children were young, and she was their world. She would close her eyes and imagine them running through the house, laughing, asking for her help with their schoolwork, and sharing their dreams with her. Those memories were precious and they kept her going. But they also reminded her of how much she had lost. The reality of her loneliness was hard to bear, but Margaret held on to those memories, hoping that one day things would change. In the quiet of her house, Margaret often wondered if her children even thought about her anymore. Did they remember her birthday? Did they ever wonder how she was doing? She had no way of knowing, and it hurt. It hurt that she was no longer a part of their lives, that they had moved on without her. But still, she held on to the hope that one day they would return, that they would remember her and realize how much she needed them. As the days passed, Margaret's strength continued to fade, but her spirit remained. She wasn't ready to give up. She wasn't ready to let go of the hope that someday things would be different. She didn't know when or how it would happen, but deep down, she still believed that she would see her children again. Until then, she would endure the silence, the cold, and the loneliness, holding on to the memory of a time when her house was full of life. One cold afternoon, when the wind howled against the windows and the sky outside was a dull gray, Margaret shuffled across her room. Her steps were slow and cautious, as if the weight of the years had settled into her very bones. She had just finished cleaning a small corner of the room where dust had collected in thick layers. The task had taken her longer than usual, and her body ached from the effort. Her back was stiff, her legs sore, but she carried on. It was all she could do. As Margaret moved toward her bed, her foot caught on something. She stumbled slightly, her hands reaching out to steady herself. At first, she thought it was just another old piece of furniture or debris from the years of neglect. But when she bent down to look, she saw something unusual, something that didn't belong there. Under the bed, hidden in the shadows, was a small, old wooden box. It wasn't much to look at, just a simple box, a little worn with age, but something about it caught Margaret's attention. It was almost as if the box was calling out to her, urging her to open it. She crouched down, her knees creaking in protest as she reached for it. It had been so long since she had touched anything other than the basic necessities, and the thought of discovering something new, something that could bring her out of the darkness, filled her with a flicker of excitement. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the box from under the bed. The dust that had gathered on it was thick, but Margaret wiped it away, revealing the worn edges of the wood. It was old, older than anything she had in the house. She wasn't sure why, but she felt a strange sense of anticipation as she placed the box on the floor in front of her. Her heart beat a little faster, and she wondered what could be inside. Slowly, Margaret opened the box. Inside, she found a small, neatly folded envelope. The envelope, too, was old, but the handwriting on the front was clear and precise. Margaret's hands shook as she turned the envelope over, her breath catching in her throat. It was addressed to her. The realization hit her like a wave. Someone had left something for her. But who? She couldn't remember the last time anyone had written to her. For a moment, she simply stared at the envelope, wondering if she was imagining things. Her children hadn't written to her in years, and it was hard to believe that anyone else would send her a letter. But this envelope had her name on it, and that alone made her hands move almost automatically. She tore open the envelope, her heart racing, and pulled out the letter inside. The paper was old, but it smelled faintly of perfume, a scent she hadn't encountered in a long time. She unfolded it carefully, eager to see what was written. The letter was short, but the words inside made her heart leap. "I know you've been struggling, but you're not alone. Love, your daughter." For a moment, Margaret couldn't believe her eyes. Her daughter, Emma, had written to her. She felt a rush of emotions flood over her. Relief, hope, and joy all mixed together in her chest. Her daughter, who had been distant for so long, had reached out to her. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she held the letter to her chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world. She couldn't understand why Emma had stayed away for so long. Why had it taken this long for her to reach out? The years of silence, the missed birthdays, the loneliness, had it all been because Emma didn't care anymore? But now, here was a letter, a small piece of connection, a reminder that she hadn't been forgotten completely. Margaret sat there on the floor, clutching the letter, letting the tears fall freely. She didn't care about the mess, the dust, or the coldness of the house anymore. In that moment, she felt a warmth inside her that she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the warmth of a fire, but the warmth of love, of hope. She stared at the letter for a long time, reading the words over and over again. "You're not alone," it said. The words echoed in her mind. For the first time in so long, Margaret didn't feel so isolated. She wasn't sure what this letter meant, whether Emma was ready to come back into her life, but it didn't matter. The fact that her daughter had reached out gave Margaret something to hold on to, something to believe in again. The letter was a lifeline. Margaret could see her daughter's handwriting so clearly in her mind. She could almost hear Emma's voice reading the words to her. She could imagine Emma's face, the way she would smile when she was happy. The thought of it made Margaret's heart swell. She wanted to believe that this was just the beginning of something new, something good. Perhaps Emma was ready to reconnect. Perhaps things could be different now. Margaret stood up slowly, feeling a rush of energy she hadn't felt in years. The letter was still clutched tightly in her hand, and she couldn't help but smile. For the first time in so long, she felt a spark of hope. The house, which had once felt so cold and empty, suddenly didn't seem as bleak. The dust on the floor didn't matter. The peeling walls didn't matter. What mattered was the letter, the connection to her daughter that she had longed for. She took the letter over to the small table where she kept her keepsakes and placed it carefully inside a drawer. It felt safe there, like a treasure she needed to protect. She couldn't stop looking at it, imagining what it meant, wondering if Emma was planning to visit. Maybe she was just waiting for the right time. Maybe this was the start of something new, a new chapter in their relationship. Margaret didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in so long, she allowed herself to hope. She wasn't alone. Her daughter still cared. That simple thought was enough to make her feel stronger, to make her believe that maybe, just maybe, everything could be okay. For the rest of the afternoon, Margaret couldn't stop smiling. The letter had rekindled something inside her, something she had almost forgotten. Hope. As the day turned into night, she looked out the window once more, but this time the world outside didn't seem as distant. The future, though uncertain, no longer felt so dark. She had something to hold on to now. She wasn't sure when or how, but she believed that things would change. That letter, that simple note from her daughter, had reminded her of the love they once shared, and that was all she needed. Margaret felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Her children might have moved away, but maybe this letter was a sign that they hadn't completely forgotten her. And with that thought, she went to bed that night with a small but powerful sense of hope in her heart. The days following the discovery of the letter were filled with a new sense of purpose for Margaret. For the first time in years, she had a reason to look forward to something. The letter from her daughter, Emma, had brought a rush of emotions that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Margaret had spent so many years feeling abandoned and forgotten, but now there was hope. The small, simple words on that piece of paper had rekindled a spark of optimism in her heart. Margaret couldn't stop thinking about the letter. She had read it over and over again, each time feeling a little less lonely, a little more connected to the daughter she hadn't seen in so long. "You're not alone," the letter had said. It was a small phrase, but it meant the world to Margaret. For so long, she had believed that no one cared, that her children had moved on with their lives and forgotten about her. But this letter was proof that wasn't the case. Emma had remembered her. Emma had reached out, even if it was just through a few lines of text. In the days that followed, Margaret worked with a renewed energy. She couldn't sit idly by anymore. She had spent so much of her life waiting for something to change, but now she had to be the one to make the first move. The house was still in disarray, and there was still much work to be done, but Margaret wasn't afraid of the effort anymore. For the first time in a long time, the work felt worth it. She wasn't just cleaning a house, she was preparing for something important. She was preparing for a visit, for a reunion, for a new chapter in her life. Every day, she cleaned and tidied the house, focusing on small tasks at first. She cleaned the kitchen thoroughly, wiping down the counters and washing the dishes that had piled up. She swept the floors and dusted the furniture. It was slow work, and her body ached from the physical effort, but the pain didn't bother her anymore. There was something invigorating about having a purpose, about knowing that the work she was doing was leading to something better. She even found the energy to rearrange the furniture in her living room. It had always been arranged the same way for years, but now she wanted to change things. She wanted to make the house feel fresh, to give it a sense of life that had been missing for so long. Margaret moved the chairs around, shifted the small table by the window, and made sure the flowers in the vase were placed neatly on the coffee table. It wasn't much, but it made the room feel brighter, more welcoming. The evenings were no longer as lonely as they once were. Margaret would sit in her chair by the window, but instead of staring out at the empty street, she would think about the future. She imagined what it would be like to see Emma again. What would they say to each other? Would Emma bring her family? Would there be a warm embrace, a long-overdue conversation? Margaret wasn't sure, but she couldn't stop thinking about it. The house still felt quiet, and the loneliness hadn't disappeared entirely, but Margaret had begun to accept that the quiet was not the same as emptiness. The house, once a place of despair, had begun to feel more like a home again. Every corner Margaret cleaned, every task she completed, felt like a step toward something new. She knew there was still so much to be done, but now it felt like a journey worth taking. The work didn't seem as difficult, the silence didn't feel as heavy, and the days didn't stretch out endlessly before her. There was still no word from Emma after the letter, and that caused Margaret to wonder. Was her daughter planning to visit? Was she waiting for the right time to come? Margaret didn't know, but the uncertainty didn't bother her as much as it had before. The letter had given her the comfort of knowing that Emma cared, that she hadn't forgotten her. That was enough for now. One afternoon, after finishing a long day of cleaning, Margaret sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow through the window. Margaret watched the light shift across the room, the shadows growing longer as the day came to an end. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to smile. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she was no longer afraid. She had her memories, she had the letter, and she had the hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she had once thought. As she sipped her tea, Margaret felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the tea or the sunlight. It was a feeling of peace, a feeling that she hadn't known in years. She had been through so much in her life, so many difficult days, so many lonely nights, but now she could see a way forward. The past would always be a part of her, but it didn't have to define her. She could still build something new, still make the most of the time she had left. Margaret's hope was like a small flame in the darkness, flickering but never extinguishing. It wasn't the grand, dramatic change she had once hoped for, but it was enough. It was enough to carry her through the days, to remind her that there was still a chance for something better. And for the first time in so long, that was enough. The days following Margaret's renewed hope were filled with a quiet anticipation. She had spent countless hours cleaning, rearranging, and making her home a place where she could feel proud again. The house, which had once felt like a prison, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where something beautiful could bloom, even after years of neglect. Margaret had worked so hard, not just to clean her house, but to clean her heart. Every task she completed felt like a step closer to something she had longed for, a reunion with her daughter. As the weeks passed, Margaret's hope only grew stronger. She continued to think about the letter, reading it again and again. She wondered when Emma would come. Would she come soon? Would she bring her family? Margaret found herself imagining what it would be like to see her daughter again, to hold her in her arms, to tell her how much she had missed her. The thought of it was both comforting and terrifying, as the uncertainty about what Emma's visit might bring lingered in the back of her mind. Would things feel awkward? Would there be things left unsaid between them? She didn't know, but she was determined to embrace whatever came. One morning, as Margaret was cleaning the kitchen, she heard a soft knock at the door. It was a gentle, hesitant sound that startled her, breaking the stillness of the house. For a moment she froze, unsure of what to do. Her heart began to beat faster, and she felt a rush of excitement and fear all at once. Could it be? Could this be the moment she had been waiting for? She quickly wiped her hands on her apron, and without thinking, she walked toward the door. Margaret's hands shook as she reached for the doorknob. She could barely contain her emotions as she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. Standing there on the other side of the threshold was Emma. For a long moment they just stood there, staring at each other. Margaret's heart was pounding in her chest. Her daughter, her sweet, beautiful daughter, was standing right in front of her. It felt unreal, like something out of a dream. Emma looked different, of course, older, with lines around her eyes that spoke of the years that had passed. But her eyes, the same eyes Margaret remembered, shone with warmth and tenderness. And then, before Margaret could say a word, Emma stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her mother in a tight, long-overdue embrace. Margaret stood there, overwhelmed with emotion, letting the tears flow freely. She had dreamed of this moment for so long, and now it was finally happening. Emma's presence filled the room with warmth, and Margaret could feel the years of loneliness melting away with each passing second. "I'm so sorry, Mom," Emma whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I should have come sooner. I should have never let it go this long." Margaret didn't say anything at first. She didn't need to. The years of hurt and abandonment were still there, buried deep inside her, but they didn't matter in that moment. What mattered was that her daughter was here, right here with her. They had so much to say to each other, but for now, just being together was enough. After a long moment, Emma pulled back slightly, her eyes searching her mother's face. "How are you? Really?" she asked softly. Her voice was full of concern, as if she had only just realized how much time had passed since they last spoke. "I'm better now," Margaret replied, her voice thick with emotion. She smiled through her tears, her hands gently resting on Emma's shoulders. "I've been waiting for you," Emma nodded, her eyes shining. "I know, Mom, I know. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you. I was so caught up in my own life that I lost sight of what really mattered." Margaret shook her head, brushing away her tears. "You don't need to apologize. Life happens and we all get busy, but just knowing you're here now, well, that's enough for me." The two of them stood there for a while, holding each other, letting the moment sink in. The years of silence and distance seemed to vanish, replaced by the bond that had always existed between them, no matter how much time had passed. It was as if they had never been apart. Margaret could feel the love in Emma's embrace, and for the first time in so long she felt truly seen, truly heard. She wasn't invisible anymore. Her daughter had returned, and with her came a future full of possibilities. After a while, Emma stepped back and looked around the house. "You've really made this place your own again, haven't you?" she said, her eyes taking in the neatness, the warmth, the small changes Margaret had made. "It looks beautiful in here, Mom." Margaret smiled softly, pride swelling in her chest. "It's been a lot of work, but it feels good. It feels like home again." "I'm so proud of you," Emma said, her voice full of admiration. "I know it's been hard, but look at you. You've done so much on your own." "I'm sorry I wasn't here to help." Margaret shook her head. "You don't need to apologize. I did it because I wanted to, and now we're here together." Emma smiled, and for the first time, it felt like they were both starting something new, something that could heal the old wounds and build a new foundation for their relationship. There was so much they needed to talk about, so many years to catch up on, but Margaret wasn't in a rush. They had time now, time to rebuild, to reconnect, to make new memories together. As the day went on, they talked. They laughed, shared stories, and even cried a little. It wasn't a perfect reunion. There was still pain and sadness between them. But it was real, and it was the beginning of something beautiful. They had both suffered in their own ways, but now they had each other again. And that was enough to heal the scars of the past. Margaret's heart was full in a way it hadn't been in years. She realized that while life had been difficult, it had also given her a second chance. She had her daughter back. She had a new chapter ahead of her. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret allowed herself to believe that the future could be bright. The house, once so lonely and cold, now felt full of life again. There was laughter echoing through the halls and warmth in every room. The silence that had haunted Margaret for so long was replaced by the sound of love, connection, and hope. Margaret looked out the window as the sun began to set, painting the sky with soft shades of pink and orange. It was a new day, a new beginning. And for the first time in years, Margaret felt like she had everything she needed. Her daughter was back, and that was all that mattered.